I don't remember the exact day things changed. That's the strange part. There was no argument, an raised voice, an moment where someone said something they couldn't take back. If anything, everything stayed polite, gentle, respectful, and yet something slipped away. I noticed it in the pauses first. Saad used to talk to me about everything, his work, his worries, the small irritations that followed him home at the end of the day. Even when he was tired, even when he didn't want advice, he still wanted presence. He would sit across from me, scrolling through his phone, half listening, half speaking, comforted simply by knowing I was there. After he married Sanaa, that didn't stop immediately. That's important. People think change happens overnight. It doesn't. It arrives quietly, disguised as adjustment. At first, Saad still came to me. Just less often. He would start a sentence, then stop. Smile. Say, "Never mind, Amy. It's nothing." I told myself that was normal. A married man deserves privacy. A new life needs room to breathe. I believed that. But conversations don't disappear all at once. They thin out. They shorten, they lose weight. Soon, our talks were about weather, groceries, appointments. Necessary things. Practical things. Things that didn't require emotional space. And I didn't question it. I didn't want to be that mother. The one who clings, the one who demands attention, the one who competes with a son's marriage. So I adjusted. Quietly.
Sanaa was good to me. Kind.
Respectful. She greeted me warmly, included me when it felt appropriate, asked my opinion on small household matters. There was no cruelty in her. No intention to push me out. But she had her own world with Saad. A private language. A shared rhythm. And I began to feel like a guest in conversations I once led. I would sit with them in the evenings, listening as they discussed plans, weekends, finances, future goals. Sometimes I would open my mouth to speak, only to realize the moment had already passed. So I closed it again. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe this was just the natural course of life. I reminded myself of everything I had hoped for Saad: independence, happiness, partnership. I had raised him to stand on his own, to build a life that didn't revolve around me. And now that he had, I told myself I should be proud. Still, pride doesn't erase absence. I noticed how he stopped looking at me before making decisions. How he no longer asked, "What do you think?" How his eyes went instinctively to Sanaa now, not me. That wasn't wrong. But it was new. And new things take time to settle. There were days when he came home tired and went straight to his room. Days when dinner was quiet, not uncomfortable, just distant. We were together, but no longer connected in the same way. Silence filled the space where conversation used to live. And I let it. Because silence felt safer than saying the wrong thing. I thought if I stayed quiet, I would preserve peace. If I didn't speak, I wouldn't interfere. If I didn't ask, I wouldn't be disappointed. What I didn't realize then was that silence doesn't just protect relationships. Sometimes it rewrites them. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the kitchen, holding my phone, wondering who I would call if something important happened. The thought startled me. There was a time when the answer was obvious. Now, it wasn't. I wasn't lonely, not exactly. The house was full. Laughter still echoed through the halls. Love still existed here. But it existed around me, not with me. And that difference mattered. I didn't argue, I didn't complain, I didn't demand explanations. I watched. I adjusted. I grew quiet. Because I believed that silence was temporary. I didn't know yet that silence, once learned, becomes a habit. And habits change everything. Love did not leave our house. That is something I want to be very clear about. There was still warmth in Saad's voice when he spoke to me. Still respect in the way Sanaa addressed me. Still shared meals, shared space, shared history. Nothing broke. And yet, something loosened. Love stayed. Attention drifted. That difference is easy to miss, especially if you are not the one slowly losing it. I noticed it in the way Saad listened. He heard me, but he didn't lean in anymore. When I spoke, his eyes would flicker briefly, toward his phone, toward Sanaa, toward the clock. Not rudely, not intentionally, just instinctively, like his focus had learned a new resting place. I would finish a sentence and feel the air go still, waiting for a response that never quite arrived. So I learned to end my thoughts early. Sana, too, was loving in her own way. She checked on me, made sure I was comfortable, asked if I needed anything. But her care was practical, not emotional. She was attentive to my needs, but not to my silences. And I didn't blame her. She was building a marriage, a partnership, a future. I remembered being young once, too, how the world narrows when love feels new and urgent. How everything else fades into the background, not because it lacks value, but because your heart can only hold so much at a time. Still, knowing that didn't soften the feeling of being gently pushed to the edges. There were moments when all three of us sat together, the television on, the room warm and familiar. From the outside, we looked like a peaceful family. Inside, I felt like a quiet observer. Saad and Sana would exchange glances, small ones, quick ones, meanings passing silently between them. I recognized that language. I had once spoken it with Saad myself, when he was younger, when a look was enough. Now, those looks no longer included me. Sometimes I wondered if they even realized it. I think that's what hurt the most. If someone ignores you deliberately, there is anger to hold on to, words to respond to, boundaries to draw. But when attention fades unintentionally, you are left with nothing to fight against. Just absence. I tried, at first, to stay present, to remain part of conversations, to offer opinions when they were asked for, though they rarely were. When I did speak, I chose my words carefully. Too much advice felt intrusive, too little felt invisible. So I aimed for just enough. But just enough is a difficult balance when no one tells you where the line is. One evening, Saad mentioned a possible change at work. A relocation. A new opportunity. My heart lifted. This was the kind of thing he used to discuss with me for hours. I waited. He didn't ask what I thought. Sana responded instead. They talked it through: logistics, pros and cons, future plans. I listened, nodding occasionally, my thoughts carefully folded away. When the conversation ended, Saad stood up and said, "We'll think about it."
We.
Not us. Not all of us.
Just we.
And I realized then that love had not vanished, but my place within it had shifted. I went to my room that night and sat on the edge of the bed longer than usual. I asked myself questions I had been avoiding. Was I holding on too tightly or letting go too easily? Was this transition healthy, or was I slowly erasing myself? The answers did not come. So I chose the path that felt least disruptive. Silence. Silence required no explanation. Silence preserved harmony. Silence asked nothing of anyone. I stopped offering unsolicited thoughts, stopped filling quiet moments with conversation, stopped trying to reinsert myself where I no longer fit naturally. I told myself I was being mature. And maybe I was. But maturity, I learned, can look a lot like disappearance if you're not careful. Days pass like this, gentle, polite, distant. No raised voices, and slammed doors, no tears. Just a growing quiet where connection used to live. I noticed how easily routines replaced conversations. Breakfast became efficient. Dinner became brief. Evenings passed with everyone in their own mental space, together but separate. Sometimes Saad would tell me about his day, but only in summary. The details, the emotions, the things beneath the surface, those belonged to Sana now. That was natural. But it still felt like loss. I remembered the nights he used to come to me when something troubled him, sitting beside me in silence until he found the words. Now he had someone else to do that with. I was happy for him. Truly. But happiness and grief are not opposites. They coexist easily. There were moments when I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the growing distance. But every sentence I rehearsed felt unnecessary, out of place, or selfish. So I said nothing, because love was still there. And I didn't want to disturb it. I convinced myself that attention was not something I should expect, that it was my job to step back gracefully, to let my son build a life without me at its center. But no one warns you how painful it can be to step back so far that you're no longer sure where you stand. Late one night, as I turned off the lights, a thought settled quietly in my chest. I am still loved, but I am no longer looked for. And that realization, gentle, unspoken, undeniable, told me more than any argument ever could. I didn't decide to stop talking all at once. It happened in pieces. A sentence I swallowed halfway through, a thought I kept to myself, a question I didn't ask because the moment had already moved on. At first, it felt temporary, like holding your breath while waiting for the right time to speak. But the right time never came. So I learned. I learned how to measure my words before letting them out. How to read the room quickly and quietly. How to tell when my voice would land gently and when it would fall flat, unanswered. I began editing myself. Not out of fear, not out of resentment, but out of awareness. There is a certain look people have when they are listening out of politeness rather than interest. Their eyes soften, but their attention drifts. I saw that look more often now, and I didn't want to be a burden on their focus. So I shortened my stories. I stopped mid-thought when I sensed distraction. I laughed lightly when I wanted to say more. I nodded instead of offering opinions that had not been asked for.
It was easier this way.
Silence, I discovered, has a strange power. It keeps things smooth, undisturbed, predictable. No misunderstandings, and awkward pauses, and reminders that roles have shifted. When I stayed quiet, the house felt calmer. And so did everyone else. That became my signal. If my silence maintained peace, then perhaps silence was what was required of me now. One afternoon, Sana was telling Saad about a disagreement at work. She spoke quickly, emotionally, hands moving as she explained. Saad listened carefully, asked questions, offered reassurance. I watched from the corner of the room. Once, I would have joined that conversation naturally, not to advise, but to listen, to affirm, to share perspective. Now, I stayed still. When Sana finished, she sighed and leaned back. Saad smiled at her and said, "You handled it well." I nodded in agreement. That was enough. Later, as I washed dishes, I wondered when my role had become observational instead of participatory. But I didn't dwell on it. Dwelling invites bitterness. And bitterness changes the way silence feels. I didn't want my silence to become heavy. So, I made it intentional. I told myself I was choosing quiet, not being pushed into it. That distinction mattered. When Saad spoke to me, I listened fully. When he didn't, I didn't chase the conversation. I answered questions briefly.
Kindly.
Without elaboration. He noticed, eventually. "You're very quiet these days," he said one evening. I smiled. "I suppose there's less to say." That wasn't entirely true, but it was easier than explaining. He didn't push.
And that, too, told me something.
Silence had become comfortable for him as well. There were moments when I felt a sharp urge to break it, to remind him of the closeness we once shared, to say, "I'm still here." But then I would remember how natural his distance seemed to him now, and I would let the moment pass. I didn't want to force my presence into a life that had learned how to move without it. At night, alone in my room, words returned to me easily. Thoughts flowed freely when there was no one to hear them. I replayed conversations I hadn't had, responses I hadn't given, emotions I hadn't expressed. But by morning, I folded them away again. Daylight required restraint. I noticed how silence changed me, not just outwardly, but inwardly. I became more observant, more patient, more aware of emotional undercurrents others didn't notice. I learned the difference between being ignored and being unnecessary. Ignored feels sharp, unnecessary feels quiet. And quiet pain is harder to explain. Sometimes Saad and Sana would make decisions, small ones, everyday ones, without involving me. Where to go for dinner? Who to invite over?
How to spend the weekend?
I didn't object. I didn't comment. I simply adjusted. Adjustment, I told myself, is maturity. But there is a fine line between adapting and erasing yourself. I walked that line carefully. When guests came over, I smiled and greeted them warmly, then stepped back. I let Sana host. I let Saad lead conversations. I took pride in my ability to be present without interfering.
People praise me for it.
"You're so understanding," someone once said. I nodded. They didn't know how much effort understanding required. Understanding meant constantly reminding myself that this was not rejection, it was evolution. That my silence was not punishment, it was accommodation. But accommodation, repeated too often, becomes habit. And habit becomes identity. I began to see myself differently, not as the center of the family, not even as a pillar, but as a quiet background presence. Reliable, stable, unchanging. Furniture doesn't speak. Furniture doesn't need attention. Furniture is simply there. That thought unsettled me more than I expected, because I was still a person, still a woman, still someone with thoughts, needs, and emotions. I just wasn't expressing them anymore. One evening, as I sat alone after everyone had gone to bed, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad in the way people expect sadness to look. I was muted, like a song turned down so low it still exists, but barely. Silence had protected me from rejection, but it had also protected everyone else from knowing me. And that realization stayed with me. Because silence doesn't just keep the peace. It also slowly teaches people how little noise you make. And once they learn that, they stop listening for you altogether. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and wondered when silence had become my language. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned exactly when my words would no longer matter. And that knowledge, quiet, unspoken, deeply personal, told me more than any argument ever could. Change doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock on the door and ask permission. It arrives quietly, settles in, and by the time you notice it, it already belongs there. I saw it in Saad long before I admitted it to myself. It wasn't that he became distant. He was still kind, still respectful, still called me Amy in the same familiar tone, still asked if I'd eaten, if I was feeling well, if I needed anything. But kindness is not the same as closeness. He had grown self-contained. Once his thoughts spilled out easily. Now they stayed organized, filtered, shared only when necessary. He spoke with intention, not habit. Conversations felt planned rather than natural. I watched him choose words carefully, especially around me, as if he didn't want to say the wrong thing, as if there were invisible rules now. That hurt more than bluntness ever could. I noticed how he consulted Sana instinctively, his eyes finding hers in a room full of people, seeking confirmation before speaking, smiling when she smiled. Their connection was strong, effortless, deeply mutual. And I was glad for him. Truly. This was the partnership I had prayed for. Still, prayer doesn't prepare you for what it costs. There were moments when Saad would start telling me something, then stop midway. He'd glance at Sana, then say, "I'll tell you later." Later never came. At first, I assumed it was forgetfulness. Life gets busy. Priorities shift. But repetition teaches you patterns. And this pattern was clear. I no longer received the unedited version of my son. I received the summary. One afternoon, I overheard Saad laughing in the other room. Deep, unrestrained laughter. The kind that comes from comfort, from being fully yourself. I smiled without realizing it. When I entered the room, the laughter softened. Not stopped, but changed. The moment adjusted itself around me. They were still warm, still welcoming, but the atmosphere shifted, like music lowering in volume. No one did this intentionally. That's what made it harder. If there had been anger, I could have responded. If there had been conflict, I could have addressed it. But there was only adaptation. And adaptation leaves no one to blame. I started to feel like I was meeting a new version of Saad every few months, each one slightly more distant from the boy I raised. Not in love, and dependency. He no longer leaned on me emotionally. He didn't need my reassurance the way he once had. His worries were shared elsewhere now, processed privately, resolved without me. That's called growth. I knew that. But knowing something doesn't always make it easier to accept. I remembered the nights when he couldn't sleep and came to sit beside me, talking softly in the dark. The days he asked my opinion before making even small decisions. The way he once looked at me as if my presence alone made things manageable. That look was gone, replaced by confidence, replaced by independence, replaced by a life that functioned well without my input. I watched Sanaa take on roles I once held, not out of replacement but out of progression. She knew his routines, his preferences, his moods. She understood his silences the way I once had. That knowledge was no longer mine to carry. And I let it go without ceremony. There were times when I wanted to say something, not to criticize, not to interfere, but to acknowledge the shift. To say, I see you changing. To say, I'm adjusting too. But words like that complicate things. And silence kept everything smooth. So I stayed quiet. I stayed supportive. I stayed out of the way. One evening, Saad mentioned a decision he and Sanaa had made, something significant, something that would affect all of us. He spoke confidently, casually, as if the matter had already settled. I nodded. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer input. Not because I didn't have thoughts, but because the decision no longer included space for them. And that was okay. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Later that night, I realized something that unsettled me deeply. If Saad had changed this much without an argument, without resistance, without even discomfort, then this wasn't a phase. This was permanent. Silence had done its work. It had gently redrawn boundaries, redefined roles, and repositioned me in my own family without a single difficult conversation. And that's when I understood the truth. Arguments hurt, but they leave room for resolution. Silence doesn't fight. It replaces. It erases without conflict. I lay awake that night, listening to the quiet house, and wondered how many other changes were still coming. Changes I would accept without protest, without acknowledgement, simply because I had learned how to be quiet. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt relocated. From center to side, from participant to observer, from essential to optional. And no one had done anything wrong. That was the hardest part, because when silence teaches you something, it doesn't raise its voice. It simply shows you where you stand. And that position, once revealed, is impossible to unsee. Family gatherings used to feel like anchors. No matter how busy life became, those moments brought everything back into focus. The house would fill with voices, movement, overlapping conversations. I had always been at the center of it, not by force, but by familiarity. People naturally turned toward me.
I didn't notice it then.
I notice it now. The first time I realized something had shifted, it wasn't dramatic. It was almost unremarkable. Everyone was sitting in the living room, talking over tea. Saad and Sanaa were discussing future plans with relatives, career steps, possible travel, long-term goals. The conversation moved easily, confidently, like a well-rehearsed rhythm. I listened. I smiled when appropriate. I waited for a pause that never came. At one point, someone asked a question that I knew the answer to, something from Saad's childhood, something I alone would remember. I leaned forward slightly, ready to speak. But before I could, Saad answered himself. He didn't look at me. He didn't realize. And that moment passed. It was small, almost invisible, but something inside me tightened. Not from anger, from recognition. This was what it meant to no longer be central. Not excluded, just unnecessary. As the evening went on, I noticed how often people spoke around me instead of to me. Conversations flowed past my presence, assuming my agreement, my approval, my understanding, without inviting my voice. And I allowed it, because stepping in felt like interruption. I told myself that being central was never the goal. That family isn't about attention, it's about connection. But connection, I realized, needs acknowledgement. And acknowledgement requires space. I wondered when my space had quietly closed. There was a time when my silence would have been noticed. Someone would have asked, "What do you think?" Or, "You're quiet, are you okay?" Now, quiet was expected of me. And expectation has a way of becoming invisible. I watched Sanaa move comfortably through the room, confident, gracious, engaged. She fit into the role effortlessly. She belonged there in a way that was current, active, alive. I wasn't jealous. I was aware. There's a difference. Jealousy wants what someone else has. Awareness understands what has been lost. As people began to leave, they thanked Sana for the evening, complimented the food, praised her hospitality. She smiled warmly, genuinely pleased. I felt proud of her. And also strangely displaced. Later, as I cleared the cups from the table, Saad came into the kitchen. "You didn't say much tonight," he said casually. I shrugged. Everyone else had plenty to say. He nodded, distracted.
Yeah.
It was a good evening. And that was it. No concern. No curiosity. Just acceptance. That acceptance told me everything. I realized then that I wasn't just adjusting to change. I had already adjusted. My presence had shifted from guiding to supporting, from speaking to facilitating. I was part of the structure now, not the conversation. And structures are appreciated, but rarely noticed. I thought about all the ways I had minimized myself to make room for others. How often I chose silence over expression, restraint over relevance. I had done it willingly, lovingly. But love, when always quiet, risks being overlooked. That night, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and allowed myself a moment of honesty. I missed being needed. Not in a dependent way, not in a controlling way, but in a way that said, "Your presence matters here." I didn't need authority. I needed acknowledgement. And silence had slowly taken that from me, not because anyone intended it to, but because silence is efficient. It removes friction. It keeps peace. It smooths edges. But it also smooths people out until they blend into the background. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dramatic sorrow. I felt a quiet grief, the kind that doesn't demand attention, the kind that sits beside you and waits. I realized that if nothing changed, this would be my place from now on. Present, supportive, peripheral. And perhaps that was the natural order of things. But understanding something doesn't make it painless. As I turned off the light, I made a silent promise to myself. I would continue to love without resentment. I would continue to support without complaint. But I would no longer pretend that silence hadn't taught me something important. It had shown me where I stood. And once you see that clearly, you can't go back to not knowing. There comes a point when waiting begins to feel heavier than walking away. Not a dramatic walk, not a door slammed shut. Just a quiet shift, the moment you stop looking toward the door, hoping someone will notice you standing there. I reached that point without realizing it. I had spent so much time adjusting, accommodating, softening my presence, that I hadn't noticed how tired I had become. Not physically, emotionally. Waiting is exhausting. Waiting to be asked, waiting to be included, waiting to be needed. Each pause, each silence, required effort, required patience, required understanding. And understanding, when constantly one-sided, begins to drain you. I noticed the fatigue first in small ways. I stopped lingering in shared spaces. I spent more time in my room, not out of sadness, but out of preference. I found comfort in routines that belonged only to me: morning tea by the window, short walks, reading without interruption. Solitude felt lighter than expectation. When Saad and Sana made plans, I no longer listened for an invitation that wasn't coming. I didn't feel disappointed when they left without asking. I had already adjusted my emotional posture. I wasn't excluded anymore. I was independent. That distinction mattered to me. There is dignity in choosing not to wait. One evening, Saad asked casually, "Do you want to join us?" It was a small thing, an afterthought. I paused, not because I wanted to say yes, but because I realized something had changed. I didn't need the invitation anymore. "I'm fine here," I said gently. He nodded. No surprise. No concern. And that was okay. Because I meant it. I was fine. Not in a pretending way, in a settled way. I had stopped measuring my worth by my involvement. I began to see my silence differently, not as erasure, but as boundary. Not as loss, but as space. I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I was choosing where my energy went. That realization brought unexpected peace. I no longer replayed conversations in my head at night. I no longer wondered if I should have spoken up. I no longer felt the urge to insert myself into moments that didn't require me. I existed without needing permission. And that felt new. There were still moments of ache, brief, sharp reminders of what had been. A shared laugh I wasn't part of. A decision made without consultation. A memory triggered unexpectedly.
But they passed.
Because I had stopped resisting reality. I had accepted it. Silence had taught me something essential. Not every role is permanent. And that doesn't make it meaningless. I had been a mother in one way. Now I was becoming one in another. Less central, more distant, but still loving. And love doesn't need to announce itself to exist. One afternoon, as I folded laundry, I realized I hadn't felt invisible in weeks. Not because others had changed, because I had. I wasn't looking to be seen anymore. I was simply being. That night, as the house settled into sleep, I sat with myself, not in sadness, not in longing, but in quiet recognition. I had stopped waiting. And in doing so, I had given myself back the attention I had been quietly hoping others would offer. Silence hadn't just taught me about distance. It had taught me about self-respect. Silence is powerful, but it isn't invisible forever. Not when it comes from someone who once filled the room. I didn't intend for my quiet to be noticed. I wasn't trying to send a message or make a point. I had simply stepped back, rearranged my emotional life, and settled into a smaller, calmer space. But absence, even gentle absence, has a way of revealing itself. It started with small questions. Are you tired today? You've been spending more time alone. You don't sit with us much anymore. None of them were confrontational. None carried guilt or accusation. They were observations. And observation is the first step toward awareness. I answered honestly, without explanation. I'm fine. I like the quiet. I needed some space. I didn't soften my answers to reassure them. I didn't expand them to invite discussion. I simply stated the truth. And that truth landed differently. I saw Saad pause more often around me. Not in discomfort, but in thought. As if something he hadn't considered was slowly taking shape in his mind. One evening, he sat beside me without speaking. Not because he needed something. Not because there was a decision to discuss. Just to sit. The silence between us felt different this time. Not empty. Not distant. Intentional. He didn't fill it with questions. I didn't rush to speak. We sat the way we used to years ago, before words became necessary. That moment mattered more than any apology. Because it wasn't driven by guilt. It was driven by recognition. I realized then that people don't always understand the cost of silence until it changes its shape. When silence is passive, it blends in. When silence becomes self-contained, it stands out. Sana noticed too. She began including me in small ways, not out of obligation but awareness. Asking if I'd like tea. Sitting near me while watching television. Sharing things casually, without formality. No explanations, no emotional speeches. Just presence. And presence, when chosen, heals quietly. I didn't reclaim my old role. I didn't want to. But something new began to form, a softer connection, less demanding, more balanced. They didn't need me the way they once did. But they noticed me again. And that was enough. One night, Saad said something that stayed with me. I didn't realize how much you'd stepped back, he said, not accusing, just reflective. I looked at him calmly. I didn't announce it. He nodded. I know. That acknowledgement held more meaning than regret ever could. It told me he was learning, not from argument, but from observation, from silence. I realized then that silence doesn't just teach the one who holds it. It teaches the ones around them too, when they are ready to listen. I hadn't lost my voice. I had simply changed how it was heard. And in that understanding, something inside me softened. Not back into the past, but forward into acceptance. I no longer needed to be central. I needed to be recognized. And now, quietly, gently, I was. Belonging changes shape over time. We think of it as something fixed, a place, a role, a position we hold permanently. But life doesn't honor permanence. It honors movement. And once I accepted that, something inside me finally settled. I no longer search for signs. I no longer measure conversations or counted invitations. I stopped reading meaning into pauses. I was where I belonged, not where I used to be, but where I was now. That understanding didn't arrive suddenly. It grew quietly, strengthened by small moments that required no interpretation. Mornings became easier. I woke without expectation. I moved through my routines without feeling like I was waiting for life to begin. Life was already happening. I realized that much of my earlier pain hadn't come from being excluded, but from resisting change. From holding on to an image of family that no longer matched reality. Once I released that image, the tension eased. Saad and Sana were building something together. It was solid, intentional, deeply theirs. Watching them, I felt something close to relief. They didn't need my guidance anymore. And that was not failure. That was success. I had done my part. That realization carried pride instead of loss. I noticed how differently I listen now, without urgency, without the need to respond. I enjoyed conversations for what they were, not for what they once meant. When Sana spoke to me, I didn't search for subtext. I heard her plainly. When Saad asked my opinion, I gave it honestly, without overthinking its impact. I was no longer trying to secure my place. I had accepted it. There is peace in knowing where you stand. Not because it's ideal, but because it's clear. One evening, as we sat together quietly, I felt something unexpected. Contentment. Not joy. Not nostalgia. Just contentment. The kind that doesn't ask for more. I realized then that silence had done more than teach me about distance. It had taught me about boundaries, about dignity, about the difference between being present and being essential. I was present, and that was enough. Family doesn't always need intensity to survive. Sometimes it needs space. And in that space, love learns how to breathe differently. I wasn't invisible anymore, not because others had changed drastically, but because I had stopped disappearing. I showed up as myself, quiet, steady, whole. And that version of me belonged here too. With time, clarity arrives, not loudly, but with steadiness. I began to see my life not as a series of losses, but as a sequence of transitions. Each one necessary, each one shaping me into someone new. Motherhood, I realized, is not a single role. It has seasons. There is a season of guiding, a season of protecting, a season of letting go. I had entered the last one without preparation. And without complaint. I thought back to my own mother, how she faded quietly into the background as my life expanded. How I had assumed her silence meant contentment. Now I understood it differently. Perhaps she had also been learning where she belonged. That thought softened something in me. Generational change doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly, carried by people who love deeply enough not to resist it. I realized Saad hadn't pulled away out of neglect. He had grown forward. And growth always creates distance from where you began. That distance is not rejection. It's direction. Understanding that allowed me to release the last traces of resentment I hadn't known I was carrying. I no longer needed validation for my silence. It had already served its purpose. I had learned who I was without constant involvement. I had learned that my worth wasn't tied to my usefulness. I had learned that love doesn't disappear when attention shifts. It evolves. One afternoon, Saad spoke to me about something personal, not urgent, not dramatic. Just a thought he wanted to share. I listened without expectation. When he finished, he smiled, not the polite smile of obligation, but the relaxed one of comfort. That moment didn't restore the past. It confirmed the present. And that was enough. I understood then that silence had not taken my voice. It had refined it. When I spoke now, my words carried weight, not because they were frequent, but because they were chosen. I wasn't less important. I was simply no longer central to every scene. And that was okay. I had found balance, not by reclaiming space, but by accepting it. The silence that once felt heavy now felt instructive. It had told me more than any argument ever could. And I was finally listening. There is a kind of peace that doesn't arrive with celebration. It doesn't come with apologies or long conversations where everything is finally explained. It doesn't need tears or promises or emotional speeches. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed. I didn't realize I had found it at first. It came to me in ordinary moments, standing in the kitchen early in the morning, watching light move slowly across the floor. Sitting alone with a cup of tea, not waiting for footsteps in the hallway. Hearing Saad and Sanaa leave the house and feeling calm. Not empty. Not abandoned.
Just calm.
That was new. For a long time, peace felt like something I would reach after things were fixed. After roles were clarified. After my place was reaffirmed. But this peace didn't require any of that. It existed without conditions. I realized then that I had stopped hoping for things to return to how they were. I wasn't secretly waiting for Saad to lean on me again the way he once did. I wasn't longing to be the first person he turned to. That chapter had closed. And I had accepted it. Acceptance doesn't feel like happiness, it feels like steadiness. Like standing firmly on ground that no longer shifts beneath you. I noticed how differently I carried myself now. I spoke when I wanted to, not when I felt I should. I offered opinions without attaching my worth to whether they were followed. I listened without searching for meaning beneath every word. I was present but not dependent. In that balance, I found dignity. Saad still loved me. That never disappeared. His care showed itself in small, consistent ways. A message to check if I was okay, a pause to sit with me before bed, a gentle tone that carried familiarity. But he no longer belonged to me in the way he once had. And that no longer frightened me, because I belonged to myself again. I understood now that silence had not been punishment or neglect. It had been a teacher, patient, firm, unyielding. It had shown me the limits of control. It had revealed the truth of change. It had forced me to look inward when there was nothing left to address outward. Arguments demand winners and losers. Silence demands understanding. And understanding, once earned, cannot be taken away. I thought of all the moments I hadn't spoken. All the times I chose restraint over reaction. I no longer saw them as weakness. They were strength. They allowed me to leave the stage gracefully instead of being pushed from it. They allowed relationships to evolve without being damaged by resentment. They allowed me to preserve love without clinging to authority. One evening, as we sat together quietly, Sanaa rested her head against Saad's shoulder. I watched them, not with longing, not with loss, but with calm appreciation. They were exactly where they needed to be, and so was I. I didn't need to be central to be valued. I didn't need to be consulted to be respected. I didn't need to speak constantly to be heard. I had learned when silence mattered, and when it had said enough. There are things in life that cannot be explained without being misunderstood. But silence understands them perfectly. And when I finally stopped resisting what silence was teaching me, I found something I hadn't expected at all.
Peace.
Not because everything was ideal, but because everything was honest. And that was enough. If you are feeling this story, hit subscribe, comment, and likes for more emotional life reflections if this touched your heart. You're not alone.